Hello, and welcome back to my political opinion channel. One thing I want to point out is that I do use that word opinion very loosely, in that 90% of what I have to say is all factual and really more educational, but I do throw in a little bit of my opinion every now and then, so just to keep things on the fair side, I do refer to it as an opinion channel. So with that being said, today I'm going to be talking about federalism. So the United States has a very interesting history regarding the concept of federalism, dating all the way back to the founding of the nation, where some of the first debates arose and the first political parties were formed, largely based upon the concept of federalism. And these first parties to have been formed were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The main issue that separated these two ideologies is, of course, the concept of a federal government, where the Federalists supported the idea of having a federal government, where the Anti-Federalists supported a rather extreme form of decentralization of powers. And they essentially believed that there should not even exist a federal government, so that each state and local government would then be in charge of their own locality. So this system of having no federal government and really allowing the states and the local governments to decide how they want to operate on their own is commonly known as a confederation, or a confederation of states. And this system of government really allows people to have a lot of freedom of choice regarding what system of government they really want to live under. For instance, if there's some sweeping federal regulation that you disagree with, you pretty much have to leave the country if you don't want to live under that law. Whereas in a more decentralized system, where the states have a lot more power to decide what they want to do, if you do disagree with some kind of policy and don't want to live under it, you can just move to a different state and not have to go through all the trouble of migrating to an entire new nation. So decentralization of powers really just gives people a lot more freedom to choose what kind of society they want to live in without having to completely uproot and change their life and possibly lifestyle. So at the end of the day, with a particular regard towards military strength, the Continental Congress ultimately decided that federalism would be the way to go. I tend to agree with this outlook, but again, pretty much only in that one instance of a unified military strength. For if the United States goes to war with someone, or somebody goes to war with the United States, that's a pretty big deal. But if New Hampshire goes to war with someone, or if somebody goes to war with New Hampshire, the rest of the country may not support that, and that can cause a big crisis. So after it was decided that a federal government should in fact be in place, the Anti-Federalists agreed to compromise with this as long as within the Constitution there was included a Bill of Rights. This Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, and it really strips down to the basic bare bones level all of the natural rights that the founders believed citizens of a government are automatically entitled to. So one big concept that I will actually be delving into a lot more in the next episode, but one big concept that really separates the United States from most other republics is that the United States is a constitutional republic, which just means that it is a government bound by constitutional law, as in we have a document, the Constitution, which actually ties the hands of the government and says, these are certain rights that the citizenry is entitled to, and you're not allowed to take that away from the citizenry. On the other hand, the Federalists actually opposed the implementation of a Bill of Rights, not because they wanted the government to be extremely powerful or authoritarian, but merely because they thought it was unnecessary. The Federalists reasoned that at no point in the future would a free society of people willingly choose to give up their powers, and willingly choose to trade their rights for security. And as we have seen for a little over 200 years since then, that was obviously some very flawed reasoning. And I'm very glad that we have a Bill of Rights. And even today, some of the items within the Bill of Rights are being questioned and challenged. So now that we know what federalism is, it's important to understand what different types of federalism exist, how they work, and how they have been implemented in the United States. So the first form of federalism we're going to talk about is that of dual federalism, also known as layer cake federalism. This form of federalism is viewed as a much more bottom-up system of government, where most of the power is reserved on the bottom and trickles upward towards the federal government. In this form of federalism, state and local officials really depend upon the citizenry, so they really have to actually do a good job in order to keep their job or maintain funding. And further on up, the federal government works in very much the same way, whereas in this system the federal government is very much dependent upon the support of state governments in order to continue its policies. So how dual federalism works, and how it brings about this more bottom-up approach to the idea of government, is by the concept of division of powers. Now, this is not the same thing as separation of powers, which is how Congress works, and which ensures that no one branch of government has too much power to prop themselves up or special interest groups who support them. But rather, the division of powers looks something like this, where the federal government has their own range of jobs that they are in charge of, mostly things that cannot really feasibly be accomplished by individual state government. This includes foreign policy, as we talked about earlier, national projects such as the national post or like the interstate system, and regulation of national currency to ease frustrations of logistics and business ethics across state lines. So then a little further down, at the state and local level, we can see that these governments really have a whole lot more jobs and a whole lot more power and control over the types of governments and societies that they are setting up. And this results in the citizenry enjoying a massive amount of freedom. For under this model, the citizenry is not being dictated to or having their society controlled by some people behind a desk thousands of miles away, but rather relatable people from their own towns and their own communities who understand the problems that they face and understand how best to tackle them, or at least how the citizen wants those problems to be tackled. And even more important than government officials being relatable with their citizenry is this additional concept we find in dual federalism, where the citizenry ultimately has much more control of deciding who is in office and what kind of policies are pursued. So ultimately, this form of federalism holds each level of government accountable by making them dependent upon the level beneath them. So the next form of federalism we're going to be talking about is that of cooperative federalism, also known as marble cake federalism. This form of federalism is generally viewed as a top-down system of federalism, where the federal government reserves a bulk of the power and then the power trickles down from there. This works in a much different way than dual federalism in that powers are not divided but rather cooperatively approached through funding by the federal government. And that looks like this. So the main way that cooperative federalism differs from that of dual federalism is that instead of an approach surrounding the concept of division of powers, cooperative federalism instead offers a carrot and stick approach, a metaphor which places the state and local governments, and ultimately the citizenry, as a piece of livestock that needs to be controlled by the federal government. And that carrot and stick rationale looks something like this. So say the federal government has a policy that they want to enforce. This is a policy that the federal government wants each individual state government to enforce. Now, at the end of the day, how they get the state governments to enforce that policy is by funding the state government. So let's say that California, New Hampshire, and New York immediately decide, yeah, we're on board, we're signing on with this policy. The federal government says, great. Now we have decided that each individual state should be receiving however much money to enforce that specific policy. So here you go, there's the money. But let's say that the constituency of Ohio decides that, hey, we don't really want that, or we don't need that here. So the Ohio legislators decide, no, we don't want your federal money or the strings that come attached to it. Our citizens don't want to live under that policy, and as a result, they just don't receive the funding. This is the carrot approach, enticing state and local governments to conform with the wide-sweeping centralized regulations of the federal government. So the stick part of the equation comes in when a state or local government then decides, hey, we don't want this policy anymore. Could be from a variety of things. Maybe the federal government actually modified the policy so that it doesn't really fit in with the best needs of the constituency. Or perhaps there's been a change in constituency or the public officials in charge of that state. And maybe they just decide, hey, that's not really something that we support. So when a government decides that, hey, we don't really want to enforce this federal policy anymore, they at any time can feel free to do that, but that will result in the federal government rescinding all of their funding. In other words, the stick. This is viewed as a punitive response, where the federal government is essentially saying, I own you, you do what I want you to do, or you don't get paid. This form of government ultimately forces state and local governments, and the citizenry that has to live under them, to conform to the centralized notions of the federal government. And it also takes a massive amount of freedom away from the equation of governments saying, hey, we don't need this, but we do need this, so this is the thing that we're going to raise money for. Cooperative federalism doesn't offer any amount of freedom for that. Alright, so once again, I'd like to thank everybody for watching. I hope you liked it, I hope you learned something, and I hope you don't take my word for it. Per usual, I'd like to stress the points of critical thinking and open-mindedness and questioning everything. I really think a lot of harm and confusion have fallen upon society as a result of our tendency to just accept everything that is told to us as the absolute truth. But the information's out there, so I like to encourage everybody to back up what I have to say with the actual information, the actual facts that are out there. And if you like the video, please leave a like, please subscribe. That'll help me out a whole lot, especially when it comes to getting content out, and better quality content, and releasing content in a more timely manner. And be sure to tune in next time when I'll be talking about another one of my all-time favorite topics.